Nick, how are you doing today?
I am outstanding, Amy. How are you doing?
I am glad to hear that. I will say our weather has warmed up here. I was out in the garden all morning tilling up soil. There's something about when you do that kind of work, it just makes the world a better place.
Yeah, and I need to get on mine. Weeds everywhere.
Yeah, I will tell you, Nick, one of the things that is really important when we're talking cocktails and current events, and I think both are important in my life, but really kind of talking about the world. Let's hit on some key spots, and we're going to start, I think, with Cuba because it's closest geographically to the United States. And what are our updates there?
Yeah, so just real quick on Cuba, the humanitarian situation is deteriorating rapidly. Mexico's flotilla encountered some bad weather, so only one of the three ships made it, and that was a drop in the bucket for what they need. It's getting so dire that the hospitals are out of power, and the dialysis machines and NICU units are being operated manually by the doctors and nurses. So there are legitimately people dying right now because of this energy embargo that we've imposed. The administration is apparently still talking, but I don't know what the status of those talks are, and I still don't have a real clear idea of what exactly the administration wants. So it's incredibly unfortunate for me from a human standpoint, and hopefully we can get this resolved fairly rapidly.
Yeah, and Trump even mentioned potentially using U.S. forces there, but Cuba doesn't really have forces. So it does seem to be a bit extreme for people who are already in a very dire situation.
Yeah, a military intervention seems completely unnecessary to me. Granted, I'm not the National Command Authority, so take that for what it's worth. But it comes down to what are the objectives? And I know we don't like the communists there, although calling them communist is kind of generous. It's more they're just corrupt dictators, is what they are, and they're not great, but they're not actively like killing babies by denying them power either. So I'm not sure what the goal is, and I'd really like to get that clarified.
No, Nick, in this case, we get to be the ones killing the babies. And don't worry, you're just as qualified as anybody else. You have a cocktail and we're talking about current events. So,
yeah, fair enough.
Let's go over to Iran. And as we've discussed, we do not want this to be the Iran show, but I think talking about Iran is a good pivot to where we're going to be going next. So any updates you want to cover on Iran before we get to the
from my perspective, the real positive here is that at least we're talking with the Iranians, even if indirectly. We've both exchanged, at least publicly, maximalist positions. So the fact that there are some talks going on is definitely a positive. I suspect when all of this is done, it's going to be closer in reality to our list. It won't be the full list, but it'll look closer to that than the Iranians' demand of reparations and complete control of the Hormuz Strait. There are also additional ground forces that have been moved into the region. So the lot of chatter on that, mostly around taking Iranian islands in the Gulf and in the Strait, which is definitely easy enough for us to do, but it would pose a considerable risk and danger to our ground forces that were deployed in such a manner. So I hope that the administration thinks very, very carefully before executing any sort of ground operation.
Yeah, and I think something else about Iran to make note of is their football team, soccer team for those in the United States were out there the other day honoring. They had little backpacks for every single one of the girls who were killed by the United States in those bombings. So just once again, we need to be looking at what side of history do we want to be on? Do we want to be on the side of history where we're known for bombing children and starving little babies in NICUs? So, Nick, we're going to talk a lot about history today. And what's kind of kicked this off is the UN addressing issues specifically about the continent of Africa and really the treatment of all of Europe, of Africa for a significant amount of time of history. I'm going to zoom in on Africa and let's talk a little bit about that UN resolution and how we came to this discussion.
Yeah, so the UN General Assembly voted on labeling the slavery. Now, slavery broadly, we're going to talk about African slavery, but this is not exclusively African, the very concept of slavery. But the UN General Assembly voted to label slavery as the worst crime against humanity in history. There were, 3 countries that voted against it? The United States was one of them.
Along with our buddies Israel and then, of course, Argentina.
Yeah, so our very close allies. It's It's incredibly unfortunate in when it comes to how Africa was impacted on this. The transatlantic slave trade was probably one of, if not the most horrific versions of slavery in history. We think because of that, the chattel slavery that was for Americans, the chattel slavery that was practiced in the South is what we think of as slavery. That is not the only one, but it is a horrific example of it, and it is left a huge scar on the continent of Africa and on the populations that were transported across into the Americas. So
and you bring up an excellent point about this is not the only form of slavery, and sexual slavery is the most prominent type of slavery still going on today, still going on in the United States and across the world today. And just kind of want to highlight that aspect because, once again, trafficking in children and trafficking in women is also just a deplorable thing to do.
Yeah, and that leads you right to Jeffrey Epstein, but that's not today's topic.
Nick, we might need more cocktails.
Go a lot. Many more cocktails.
Yeah, this is definitely some heavy discussion, but we wanted to kind of open up and let's talk, first of all, just as I think as an undergraduate, I was a geography major, and so much of what we know about Africa, first of all, just a lot of people in the world don't study African history and they don't look at the geography of Africa. They look at one continent, which is super pathetic. I remember when Obama was getting elected, we never had those discussions about what did it mean to be electing somebody who did have parentage from a country in Africa and how that could impact our African relationships, which I think we would have had very different conversations had it been a different continent. But also, how is it that colonialization impacted the geography of Africa in our dealings with Africa now?
Yeah, so you look at a map of Africa, and as you mentioned, it is not by any means a single political or economic entity. It is a very, very large and very, very diverse continent. But when you look at it, you see very clean straight lines on a map. And all of those clean straight lines were drawn by European colonizers. I shouldn't say all of them. There was one exception, not just one exception, but one significant exception. The nation of Liberia was created by the United States as a means to try to repatriate slaves. It was an effort to end slavery in the United States without freeing slaves in the United States before the Civil War. So Liberia is ours. Most of the rest of them are Europe. So they came into Africa in the beginning in the 1700s and moving up to the 21st century or 20th century rather, as mostly a means of resource extraction. So the Europeans found gold, they found rubber, they found tropical fruits that they wanted back in Europe, and they exploited the African people and the African landscape to try to scratch that European itch.
And so as we're looking at that exploitation of resources, let's talk about the exploitation of resources today.
Today, okay, so resource extraction today, there are a lot of resources in Africa today that are powering the transition away from fossil fuels. Think lithium, think cobalt, think uranium, gold, copper. Africa has quite abundance of all of those resources, and it's going to be really a driver of economic growth going into the second half of the 21st century. I will say that very notably, China has identified that and has moved in aggressively to try to get mining rights in a lot of countries. They have, with a lot of their Belt and Road Initiative projects, they've built ports and railroads that, while ostensibly help the local population, are very, very beneficial to Chinese extraction of resources from the interior Africa to the ports back to the Chinese mainland, where they can be processed and refined and turned into things like computers and cell phones and solar panels.
I think an important thing to know on that too is China has been involved in Africa for a very long time. So China did some investments early, for instance, building out the headquarters for the African Union. But one of the things that's really coming out now to the African people is that initial investment, everything is shiny and pretty. But when you look a decade, 2 decades later, these things are not withstanding the test of time.
Yeah, and it's the nature of the Belt and Road Initiative. If we're stepping aside and kind of Chinese approaches, I mentioned this in an earlier episode. when they offer these on the surface fairly reasonable loans, including some gifts to African countries, and not just African but around the world, to we will help you build out your infrastructure. In the process, we may build you a nice hospital or a soccer stadium or something like that. But it doesn't end up helping the local economies to the extent that the locals think it's going to. They bring in Chinese labor to do all of this work because China has a lot of labor and they've got to keep those people employed because an unemployed population is restive, and that's a threat to the Chinese Communist Party. They also bring in Chinese materials, so concrete, steel, all of those things that China produces in abundance, because again, they can't close those factories and have unemployed Chinese. That's a threat to the Communist Party. So they produce way more than they need, and now they have to find a market for it. So when they're building a port facility in Madagascar or a railroad in Kenya, they're using Chinese materials, Chinese labor. It's financed by the Kenyans, so the Kenyans have to pay for it, or whichever country has to pay for the loan, and they get some infrastructure from it, but they didn't enjoy the employment that came along with building those things. So the locals didn't have the economic boost to their daily lives that we would expect from those sorts of projects.
Yeah, and we talked very similar when we were talking about South America, and
Yeah.
I think South America and when you're looking at Africa, some very similar, but also some very different issues going on. We've talked a lot about how are we going to even discuss Africa. It's such a just gigantic continent, and it's also a continent that when you discuss many of the countries people are not familiar with. People have not traveled to too much of Africa, and then a lot of Africa has been in constant conflict and turmoil, and a lot of times it's just very unsafe for travel. So we've got about 3 minutes left before we're going to wrap up. I knew that we're going to run against the wire. I know we want to talk about demographics just a bit, so let's go into
so on demographics, what I want to hit is they're going to be a driver, like I mentioned earlier, they're going to be a driver of global economics going into the second half of the 21st century. Right now, something like 70% of the population across Africa is under the age of 30. That's a very young population. Their population is still growing while the populations across most of the Western world, and to include China and Russia, are decreasing. And the capitalist economic model requires population growth. It's a flaw of the system, but I'm not a good enough economist to offer an alternative, so that's what we've got. The only reason the United States population is increasing is through immigration, and that has dropped off dramatically over this last year, both legal and illegal.
Last year was the first year we had a net decrease.
So when you're looking at the people who are going to actually do the economic activity that propels the global economy, you have to have a population base, a young population base to do that. And that's going to be India, it's going to be Africa, and it's going to be Latin America. Because the developed world, the Western world, the populations are aging. So we've got to take care of people on Social Security, and they're retiring. They're not actively contributing to the economy anymore. So we have to look elsewhere for those manufactured goods.
It's such a really good point there. And it reminds me of an article that I read during COVID. And a lot of discussion did not take place during COVID about the situation in Africa. And there was a doctor out of Kenya, and he wrote an article, and he wrote the top 10 things that Africa, as a whole, he was, I realize Kenya is one country, but, that Africa was focused on. And he listed several, and he wrote, in some countries, the average life expectancy age is still in the 50s. So, when you're looking at something like COVID, they didn't even have the luxury to have people vulnerable to COVID because they were dying of things at much younger ages than before COVID was even an impact.
Well, and you look at infant mortality and the mortality for mothers giving birth. We've solved these problems in the Western world. So we have the technology, we have the capability, we have the know-how. We choose not to apply the resources to helping out these countries, and it's just tragic.
It really is, Nick, and I know that we've discussed not having this discussion, but a significant impact, and I think we're going to be seeing this for decades to come, is the pullout of the USAID that had been so heavily influencing Africa and making real progress into these countries to try to improve those conditions.
Yeah. I would love to see, and I know that there are other initiatives that are trying to fill the gap, but just the sheer volume that was withdrawn with USAID is going to be almost impossible to fill those shoes.
So Nick, I feel like this was a sad episode. We've like dying children in Cuba, schoolgirls dying in Iran,
Yeah.
people not even making it to a ripe old age in Africa. So let's talk about something to give me some hope. What are you drinking today in your cocktail?
I watched The Big Lebowski here the last few days, and so in honor of the dude, I'm drinking a White Russian.
So I am very excited. I am drinking a dragon fruit Mario Brothers bubbly water today. And for everybody out there, next week is Easter, and then I am finally done with Lent, and I can go back to having actual cocktails for cocktails and current events. I'm looking forward to that. So Nick, thank you so much for your time, and we'll see everybody next week.
Yes, ma'am.